And if you can check with the Gospel Advocate and go online and things of that nature and find some excellent books and reading material on the parables, and they are rich, rich, rich in preaching material and so on. But we come now to Matthew 14. We have already discussed verses 53 through 58 of chapter 13. We tied it in with the previous section that has to do with Jesus' family, and so we're not going to go back and look at that. But in Matthew 14, you will have a continued emphasis on the rejection of Jesus. And there's some things that are going on, and that rejection started back in chapters 11 and 12. And the teachings that Jesus did in chapter 13 have to do with two classes of people that are beginning to develop. During his earthly ministry, there were those who rejected him, but there were those who received him. And so, just like today, you have the two groups. Some will follow Jesus. Some will not only not follow him, they flat out reject him. And they become antagonistic toward the very idea of Jesus being the Savior of the world, and even being a need for a Savior, because, you know, sin is not a major problem in their minds. They look at it as simply a social disorder or something like that, and that's all it amounts to. Of course, in our school systems, and not in every place, but in many places, evolution is taught as a fact, not as a theory. And creationism is just ruled out. And so if you take a couple or three generations and teach them that they're nothing more than a sophisticated animal, then they see no need of salvation. They don't even recognize sin in their lives. And basically it's the survival of the fittest, and that's no doubt in part why we have so much crime in our country. I was telling Barbara at supper tonight, I saw on the internet today where they'd made an arrest in a two-year-old murder case where those 8 people were killed up in Ohio a few years ago. And they have now arrested another family that knew that family. 4 of them went in and shot them in the beds where they slept, execution style, shot them every one in the head. There were drugs involved and custody battle involved, I noticed in the brief article that I read today. But just that type of thing goes on seemingly constantly in our country. And our world so desperately needs the teachings of Jesus. And it would do everybody good to just sit down and read and study what he has to say. Muhammad has a lot of influence in our world today through his teachings, but his teachings were completely different from the teachings of Jesus Christ. And our world really needs what we've been studying, and all the rest of the Bible as well. But this division that occurred or began to develop, the people who rejected Jesus on the one hand, people who accepted him on the other. Remember, he taught in the Sermon on the Mount that many would travel the broad way, those on the left, and there would be very few that would take the straight and narrow way. And how do you see that play out and materialize within this book? Well, the mob of people that called for Jesus' crucifixion in chapters 26 and 27 was much, much larger than the small number of disciples who assembled and waited along with the 12. About 120 of them, the Bible says. And there were no doubt some others who, you know, like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, kind of secret disciples. But still, the number of followers of Christ were far fewer than the number of people who were rejecting him and even opposing him within the book of Matthew. When you come to the crucifixion and the latter part of the book, you will have, of all people, a centurion saying, surely this was the Son of God, as he beheld the things. But that was the exception. The other soldiers had ridiculed the Lord and just heaped scorn upon him. Let's look at Matthew 14 at a glance. Just look at the 4 major sections of the chapter. You can remember these. It breaks down quite easily. You have in the first 12 verses the death of John the Baptist. Then following that, beginning in verse 13 and going through verse 21, you have the feeding of the 5,000. And then in verses 22 through 33, you have Jesus walking on the water. And then the last 2 verses of the chapter deal with additional healings as Jesus came across the Sea of Galilee to the area of Gennesaret. The people went into the countrysides and began collecting all the people who were sick, had diseases of various sorts, and they brought them to Jesus that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And we're told that they were all healed, which was a continuation of the demonstration of his power as the Son of God and proving him to be the Messiah. You'll have 3 views of Jesus presented in this chapter. First of all, you will have Herod's view of Christ. He thinks that Jesus, when he begins to hear of him and hear of the things that he's doing, he thinks immediately that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. And then we have that description of how John met his demise through the plan and plot of Herod's unlawful wife, encouraging her daughter, Herod's stepdaughter, to ask for the head of John the Baptist when she had danced before Herod and had pleased him and all of his cohorts there in, at the birthday party. It was his birthday. And it plays out in a very ugly way. And we'll talk about that in a little bit greater detail. But Herod said, he's John the Baptist. Remember when Jesus asked his disciples, whom say men that I am? And one of the first things he said, some people are saying, you're John the Baptist. And so here you have Herod saying that just a few chapters before you read of those words from Jesus. The multitude seem to have viewed Jesus as strictly a physical Messiah who could feed them, give them something to eat, as in the feeding of the 5,000. And of course, we know that many of the Jews at that time had the mistaken notion that Jesus was going to come and serve on an earthly throne, be an earthly king, have a kingdom that would be of this world that would break the yoke of the Roman rule on them. And so that view seems to be developing here in this chapter. And then you'll have the disciples out there on the sea when Jesus comes walking on the water thinking that he was a ghost. It was a spirit, an apparition. And there are people who view Jesus basically in that way today as well. So you'll have those 3 views. But anytime that we read and study the Bible, our primary purpose is to learn what the text says and to learn lessons from that. So let's read these first few verses, the first 12 verses together. Beginning in verse 1, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus and said unto his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Just to pause there for a moment. There are writers who point out that many of the Jews in that day and age believed that if someone was raised from the dead, they would automatically have supernatural powers. And Herod was not a full-fledged Jew, but he was supposedly a follower of the law of Moses and all of that, but he didn't pay much attention to it, as we'll learn in a minute. Now, Matthew inserts here something that had happened earlier. Since Herod thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead, John the Baptist must already be dead. And so Matthew inserts a description and an account of what happened in connection with the death of John the Baptist, so that we can understand and appreciate what is going on. Beginning in verse 3 now. For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. Now you can go back and read Josephus and others and find out how it was that Herodias became Herod Antipas's wife. She was married to his brother Philip. And they had an occasion to spend some time together and fell for each other. And she divorced her husband and married this Herod, his brother. Now this Herod was the son of Herod the Great by his third wife. Her name was Malthace, and she was a Samaritan. So this Herod was not a full-blooded Jew. And the Herodian family is a, well, I don't want to say interesting family. It's a very tragic story to read. All the accounts of the killings and the murders and all of that went on. But here you have a case where Herod had taken his brother Philip's wife. For John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it be given her. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison, and his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. And this would be John's disciples, came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. So Matthew has told us how it came to be that John the Baptist was dead. Now we know the details. There is a much fuller account given in the 6th chapter of the book of Mark. And I would urge you to go and read that in connection with the account here. Think about some of the similarities that existed between John and Jesus. We learn, of course, that they were related. They were cousins. We know that both were sent from God. There was a man sent from God whose name was John, we're told. He was sent as the harbinger, the forerunner, the one who came to prepare the way of the Lord. He was told to make his path straight. He came preaching repentance and telling them to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Both John and Jesus preached the same message. They preached that the kingdom was coming. They were both sent from God. Jesus was sent from heaven. And of course, John was sent in that his birth was of a miraculous sort, but it wasn't of a virgin. There was a difference in that. Both of them were persecuted for their teachings. They both met a lot of opposition. they mutually admired one another. Jesus said of John that a greater is not risen than John, but the least in the kingdom will be greater than he. Why would that be? Right, the kingdom hadn't been established, and John would not be privileged to serve in the kingdom. Jesus would later establish the church, which would be his kingdom. So John was a great man, but he was, I guess you could say, an uncommonly good common man. His clothing, the way he lived, his lifestyle was reminiscent of the way some of the Old Testament prophets lived. And indeed, Herod was right in remembering that the people considered him as a prophet. And they looked up to him and admired him. Lots of people went out and heard John preach. And both had this in common. They came unto their own people, and their own people rejected them. John would be killed because of his teaching. And I meant to include a minute ago, the New American Standard Version depicts John as continuing to tell Herod, it's not lawful for you to have her. Sometimes when we read that in the King James, we think, well, he just told him one time and that was it. But the original language gives the idea that he kept on telling him, Herod, it's not right. She is not your wife. It's not lawful for you to be married to your brother's wife. It would not only have been adulterous, but it was incestuous under the law of Moses. And so he was telling him, you're wrong. Well, Herodias didn't like that because this had, from what I read, was sort of her idea. She fell for him. Maybe he seduced her. I don't know. But anyway, they came to be married unlawfully under the law. And so John told him that, no doubt because he was concerned about his soul, and hers too. But she became angry and made life miserable for him, no doubt, to the best of her ability. There's some things that we learn from John that I think we need to remember. We learn from him the importance of truth and the willingness to suffer and even die for it. He didn't change his message to please the people. He was willing to die for the truth. He was a brave and courageous man. Herod had a lot of power. When Herod the Great died, he divided by his will the territory over which he ruled to his 3 boys that he wanted to control that area. And so he gave the northern part to one and southern part to another, and then he gave Herod Antipas that area in between that included Galilee and Idumea, I believe it was. But anyway, Herod had a lot of power. And according to Jewish history and so on, he could have people executed. But technically they were supposed to have had a trial, which they didn't. But he could order, because the Romans had put him in charge. And so he could execute people if he so deemed it necessary and wise. But, you know, you look at the trumped up charges against John, the false witnesses, no doubt, that would have spoken against him and so on. But John was a very brave and courageous man. And he was persistent in proclaiming and teaching that. So we learn a lot from John. We learn some things from Herod too. Herod was the tetrarch. He was not the king. Technically, I think the word king is used one time to describe him. but he was the ruler of a fourth. That's what tetrarch means. He had received a fourth part, as it were. And I think one of the other boys received 2 parts. But he was, as we said, a man that was unscrupulous. He would do terrible things, much like his father would. Herod the Great was a very vicious man. And you read the history of him and what he did, and I think he killed a couple of his sons, and history tells us that he believed that they haunted him, as no doubt they did. I mean, in his mind, anyway, they would have. But what do we learn from him? And I wanted to mention this too, lest we forget. This Herod Antipas, not only had the opportunity to hear John preach and teach, because the texts and the records of this incident, tell us that he evidently talked with him on more than one occasion. And that would reflect that John kept on telling him the same truth several times. You know, Agrippa and others wanted to meet with Paul on several different occasions. And so there were occasions where they had a lot of interviews with John, but this Herod also was the one who interviewed Jesus. Pilate sent Jesus to this same man. And so, you know, it probably wasn't too long after what we're reading about in Matthew 14 that Herod Antipas had the opportunity to talk with the Lord. And Jesus wouldn't even speak to him. Didn't talk to him, didn't answer him back. And Herod eventually sent him back to Pilate. You can read about that later on. But here is a man with what I've chosen to call divided loyalties. He feared John because John was respected by the people. But he feared his wife because she wanted him to do something that, in his better judgment, he shouldn't do. Now, Pilate's wife told him, "Don't have anything to do with this just man, because I've suffered many things because of him in a dream." And Pilate disregarded what his wife wanted him to do. She said, "Don't have anything to do with it." Maybe that's why he washed his hands. I don't know. But you see a man with divided loyalties and allegiance here. He can't make up his mind. He can't take a stand one way or the other, you know. And he gets himself in a predicament because of the evil things that are going on and all of that. But he wanted to please his stepdaughter, the one who danced for him. Josephus tells us that her name was Salome. It isn't given in the Scriptures. She is described as a girl. The word that is used for her is the same word that's used for Jairus' daughter, who was about 12 years old. So it's believed that this girl was probably a teenager at this time. This was a banquet of sorts. The Jews normally didn't celebrate their birthdays in that day and age. But Herod had been what we call Hellenized. Now, that's not from the word hell. That's a word that is used to describe the Greek influence and the influence of Gentile culture upon him. So he had become a man of whoever he was with, you know. I mean, he could fit in with the Jews, but he could fit in with those who were more concerned about licentious things and immoral things. He could fit right in with them. We learn from Herod, too, that a guilty conscience is not a good companion. You see, when he began to hear about Jesus, he immediately thought of John. And he knew that he had killed him unjustly. He had killed him to please a request, or to fulfill a request from somebody that he loved, maybe, by this time. Really liked the girl. And he did it to appease the people who sat with him at that drunken feast as well. He had told her with an oath that he would give her up to half the kingdom. You know, that's the very same thing that King Ahasuerus in the book of Esther promised Esther. He said, I'll give you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. And it was a very foolish thing for him to do. How did he know what she would request? But it shows you also what envy and anger will do, because the request was made for John's head. King James says a charger. The other translations say a platter. Barbara has some big platters that we use at Christmas and Thanksgiving time. Now you think about, you ladies and gentlemen probably have some of those too. I remember seeing, I had a smaller soap tray that my granddad made out of buckeye many years ago. And I was given that sometime later, and it burned when Barbara and my things burned in the house up at Baghdad. But you could put, we called it a soap tray because that's where they put the lye soap, but it was really a biscuit tray. You made biscuits in it. And I saw one of those sometime after that, and it was, you know, like this long, this wide. I mean, it was the largest one of those I had ever seen. And you just think of something like that, and a man's head is on it. I remember Brother Franklin Camp discussing this in one of his books, Old Truths and New Robes. There's 2 volumes of it. And he was talking about, you know, she no doubt thought, boy, if I could just have John killed, and if I could just have his head on a charger or on a platter, man, that would make me happy. But do you reckon she was really happy after that had been done? I seriously doubt that it brought her happiness. So many times we think we know exactly what's going to make us happy. Yet when we get it, there's always something else out there that we want a little more. But just think about how tragic that was. A guilty conscience. This man had a guilty conscience. How did he learn about Jesus? That was interesting when I began to do some reading and research on it. Herod's capital city was Tiberias, and it wasn't very far at all from Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. And when you start reading, you'll find that Herod had a steward named Chuza, C-H-U-Z-A. And Chuza's wife's name was Joanna. And she was among the women who helped support Jesus. You learn that from Luke's account in Luke chapter 8, verse 3. So Chuza could very well have brought to Herod's mind the fact that Jesus was doing all these miracles, because his wife was evidently a supporter and follower of Jesus. Here's something I thought about. Be careful how you celebrate your birthday. This was his birthday feast. Celebrating his birthday. You need to be careful how you celebrate, not only on your birthday, but any other times. Celebrations can get out of hand sometimes, can't they? There was no doubt much wine. You had drinking, you had dancing. Those two things are a deadly combination. I remember reading not long ago that there was some lady who had worked with fallen girls and women. And it was amazing, even astounding, what percentage of those women attributed these two things to their fall. So that is a bad combination. And, you know, we just need to be careful. Be careful about making rash promises, because Herod promised up to half the kingdom. The girl went and asked her mother, what do I need to ask for? Boy, the first thing in her mind, this is her opportunity. Let's kill John. Ask for his head. And so the executioner ended up being sent. A cunning woman with an angry grudge is dangerous. That's what Herodias was. She was angry at John. And she
gave up half the kingdom, really, if you think about it.
Yes.
She gave up half of the kingdom for his death.
That's right.
That's how blindly angry she was.
And so bitter. I have a quote here from a wise grandmother who said, a mean man is terrible, but a mean woman is an unholy terror. Now, ladies, none of you fit in that category. But this was a grandmother who was saying, you know, a mean woman is really mean. And we see that in the Bible. I think we have more good women in the Bible that are identified than we do bad. But you think about Jezebel, you think about this woman, and you begin to see what that grandmother was talking about, I think. Next time we'll look at the feeding of the 5,000, walking on the water, and some lessons that we can draw from those, and then go on to chapter 15. Thank you for being here, being a part of the class.